Super Mario RPG, the Super Nintendo turn-based classic from the creators of Final Fantasy.
Who doesn't cherish this amazing Squaresoft developed game that iconically features characters from Nintendo's beloved Super Mario universe? This was easily amongst the most memorable 16-bit titles of 1996, and for good reason. Well, unless, of course, you were unfortunate enough to live in a PAL region where the game, unlike most other JRPGs of the period, was simply not released at all.
I'm not bitter. Not at all. Just a little dead inside.
Still, even if many of us in the 90s had to experience the game vicariously through magazine screenshots, imported strategy guides, and breathless articles in publications like Superplay or Nintendo Magazine System, there was no denying that this impressive collaboration had captured imaginations around the world. Some of us could only dream of what this Mario meets Final Fantasy fusion played like, but our jealousy was somewhat soothed by the hopeful rumblings of a sequel appearing just around the corner. Yes, even for us Europeans, the prospect of a Mario RPG one day gracing our shelves didn't seem entirely out of reach, especially as the gaming press began to hype up whispers of a follow-up title, Super Mario RPG 2. But as you likely know, a game released under this name was sadly never to be.
So, with that said, I am Lady Decade. Hit that subscribe button, as this is the story of Super Mario RPG 2 and that strange transitional era before we got Paper Mario.
Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars stood out from the pack for a multitude of reasons. Not only was it a turn-based Mario game crafted by the same studio behind the Final Fantasy franchise, which was already synonymous with epic storytelling and genre-defining RPG mechanics, but it was also packed with features that set it apart from both typical platformers and traditional RPGs. Square had been on a roll both before and after the release of this game, delivering smash hits after smash hit that are still considered some of the greatest games the role-playing genre has ever received. Speaking of this golden era, what's better is that by using my affiliate links you can now nab Chrono Trigger for just $7.32, as well as up to 90% off of thousands of games, both retro and modern alike. Grab a shopping list of titles for next to nothing, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. As for the original Mario RPG, players were thrown into a vibrant adventure chock full of turn-based battles and quirky offbeat dialogue, all wrapped up in a visually striking isometric 3D environment created using pre-rendered graphics. It was the closest thing the SNES ever got to mimicking the look of cutting-edge CGI at the time, the same kind of visual wizardry that had been used to dazzle gamers with Donkey Kong Country. But unlike Donkey Kong's platforming focus, Super Mario RPG offered something entirely new, a role-playing experience that still felt distinctly Mario, yet richer and more narrative-driven than anything Nintendo had done with the franchise before. And, surprisingly, considering that this was a Mario game, even the story was completely different from what players had come to expect from the franchise. Essentially, rather than embarking on yet another tiresome quest to rescue Princess Peach from the clutches of Bowser, Mario instead teams up with both the damsel in distress and the dastardly Koopa King himself, along with a couple of new companions to take on an even bigger threat. It's a heartfelt, charming, and occasionally bizarre journey through an entirely new kind of Mario world, one with pipe hotels, talking swords, and a sense of humour that ranges from dry sarcasm to outright slapstick.
No wonder this one went down such a treat.
It outright proved that the Mushroom Kingdom could support a deeper story, more complex mechanics, and a fresh take on Nintendo's beloved characters without losing its identity. And speaking of successors, that brings us neatly to what happened next, or rather what almost happened. Like most big-name Nintendo titles on the Super Nintendo, demand for a sequel was immediate and fervent. So naturally, with a new generation arriving, expectations turned to the Nintendo 64, the next-generation system that promised bold, polygonal leaps forward and new ways to experience iconic franchises. Mario RPG 2 for the hardware just seemed to make sense. After all, by the late 90s, just about every major Nintendo property was making the jump to 3D. Mario, Zelda, Star Fox, all were being polygonalized and reimagined for a brave new gaming future, so it stood to reason that Super Mario RPG would follow suit. Unfortunately, fans would not have to wait long until they had the opportunity to learn more about the direction for the next Mario RPG. In fact, excitement grew simultaneously when, in a 1997 issue of the Japanese gaming magazine Dengeki Nintendo 64, revealed that none other than Shigeru Miyamoto himself had spoken about plans for the franchise's future. During an interview, Miyamoto was asked about upcoming titles in development for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. Nintendo's much hyped but ultimately doomed hardware expansion. Among his many grand promises, these included a Fire Emblem 64 and a full confirmation that Super Mario RPG 2 was not only in active development, but the game was due to launch as soon as mid-1998.
However, sadly, if you've been paying attention to gaming history, you'll already know how hilariously off the mark that prediction turned out to be.
In this same interview, Miyamoto, ever the enthusiastic showman, would go on to champion the greatness of the 64DD. In the pages of Dengeki, he boldly promised a constant flow of software releases, painting a rosy picture of an upcoming software boom. In fact, to reassure readers that this wasn't just vaporware, he went as far as to declare that the general atmosphere is that we're producing lots of software in a short period of time, so don't worry, it's not mere talk. While the promised 1998 release window quietly came and went, there was at least some movement. Just a few months prior to that deadline, in November of 1997, gamers and the gaming media finally got a glimpse of what was in store for that year's Space World trade show. It was here that Super Mario RPG 2 was officially announced as a title in development for the 64 disk drive. But, disappointingly, the project wouldn't be handled by Squaresoft this time. Which was no surprise really, given that by this point, the gate was open and the horse had already bolted to the Sony PlayStation. Instead, Intelligent Systems, Nintendo's internal affiliates best known for their work on the Fire Emblem and Famicom Wars strategy RPG series, were tasked with making the sequel. For those unfamiliar, Intelligent Systems had long been one of Nintendo's most dependable workhorses, a studio with an enviable technical pedigree and strong ties to Nintendo's first-party publishing pipeline.
So, handing them the reins to a spiritual successor for Super Mario RPG made a lot of sense, at least on paper.
According to IGN, who were in attendance at Space World 1997, a handful of brief video clips were shown to the press, offering the first visual confirmation that a sequel really was in development. These were soon followed by screenshots that made their way into magazines from the era, including still images that showcased polygonal backgrounds paired with what IGN famously described as a strange picture book feel, featuring a flat 2D Mario character placed within a semi-3D world. From what we could see of the game, it was clear that this early art direction was drastically different from the pre-rendered style of Legend of the Seven Stars, and while it would eventually evolve into the now iconic paper cutout aesthetic we associate with Paper Mario, it was obvious even then that this was going to be a very different kind of RPG. In fact, really early concept art for the game, produced even before Spaceworld 1997, showcased a visual aesthetic that was already leaning in a very different direction from its predecessor. These internal mock-ups used familiar sprites of Mario, Luigi and Yoshi, ripped straight from Super Mario World, but placed them in a new environment with storybook-style backgrounds and layered 2D assets. While rudimentary, this concept art reportedly left a strong impression on Nintendo executives. So much so, in fact, that it ended up inspiring the entire visual direction of what would eventually become Paper Mario. Other promotional materials and developmental imagery floating around in old gaming magazines from the period showed even more hints of where the project was heading. Sharp-eyed fans would spot appearances from characters lifted from Yoshi's Island, including the menacing enemy Neppy Nut and, of course, Poochie, the most radical extreme 90s dog you've ever seen.
All of these visuals made one thing clear. Super Mario RPG 2 was slowly but surely transforming into something else entirely.
The screenshots and magazine previews from the time might have shown off a 2D Mario awkwardly plonked into polygonal backdrops, but the DNA of Paper Mario was already starting to take shape. Granted, Mario's eyes might have ended up much smaller in the final retail version, but the bones were there from the very beginning. While this spiritual successor was indeed becoming something new, it wouldn't see store shelves for quite some time. Despite Miyamoto's confident claims of a 1998 release, Paper Mario wouldn't actually launch until the summer of the year 2000, a full 2 years behind schedule. So, what exactly happened in that chaotic interim period? Why did Super Mario RPG 2 get delayed so drastically, and why did it change names entirely? The first and most obvious explanation ties directly back to the hardware the game was supposed to launch on, the infamous Nintendo 64 disk drive. A machine so notorious that we've already covered it several times on this channel, and with good reason. The 64DD was, frankly, one of Nintendo's most spectacular commercial failures. Originally envisioned as a revolutionary add-on that would bring writable media and expanded memory to the Nintendo 64, the 64DD was already obsolete by the time it finally limped into Japanese stores in December 1999. By the time it arrived, it was practically pointless as advances in cartridge and manufacturing had closed the gap in storage capacity, meaning the biggest selling point of the DD had evaporated before the hardware had even launched. What was supposed to be Nintendo's answer to CD-ROM-based gaming quickly turned into a white elephant. And Super Mario RPG 2 wasn't the only high-profile casualty. The 64DD became a graveyard for ambitious projects, with titles like Mother 3, SimCity 64, Cabbage, and even an early Zelda experiment either getting scrapped entirely or cannibalized into future releases. By the end, the 64DD had become less of a revolutionary leap forward and more of a cautionary tale, a rare moment when Nintendo completely misjudged the direction of the industry.
64DD? More like 64 doo-doo.
By the time Paper Mario was nearing completion, the DD had become little more than a niche creative tool, marketed more for its Mario Paint-esque software than for traditional game releases. It was a peripheral that the majority of gamers would never own, and Nintendo knew it. So, just like many other projects originally developed for the 64DD, Super Mario RPG 2 was shifted over to a standard cartridge release instead. But that is just a portion of this crazy story. Behind the scenes, a much bigger drama was unfolding, a corporate soap opera between Nintendo and their former RPG darling, Squaresoft. As we've covered on this channel before, the relationship between Nintendo and Square went from close-knit collaboration to absolute nuclear fallout during the Nintendo 64 era. The trigger? Final Fantasy VII. When Square made the industry-shaking decision to develop their flagship RPG for the Sony PlayStation, abandoning Nintendo's cartridge-based console in favour of CD-ROMs, reportedly, Nintendo's upper brass were so incensed by Square's defection that they cut all communication with the company entirely. Square staff were even banned from entering Nintendo headquarters, a petty yet entirely on-brand response from a company not exactly known for taking criticism lightly. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was bombed, buried in cement, and paved over with a car park.
And this is where the speculation begins.
Many believe that the decision to drop the Super Mario RPG 2 name was not just a creative pivot, but a calculated act of corporate distancing. Despite Nintendo still technically owning the rights to the Super Mario RPG branding, it's widely speculated that the company deliberately abandoned it to sever any lingering association with Squaresoft. After all, if your old business partner just ran off with your arch rival, why would you want to keep their name stamped on your shiny new sequel? Even if there were no legal barriers, let's be honest, Nintendo has always been petty enough to make such a move out of sheer spite. A clean break, a fresh start. A Mario RPG, yes, but one that stood completely apart from their previous partnership with Square. Still, it's important to stress that this remains conjecture. It's equally possible that the new name Paper Mario was chosen simply to reflect the game's distinct visual identity and aesthetic direction, but come on, this is Nintendo we're talking about. Either way, the change of name marked a symbolic split and the beginning of a new RPG legacy entirely separate from Legend of the Seven Stars.
But as with most things in this industry, nothing is ever quite that clear-cut.
I think it's rather telling that remnants of the old name still linger within the game itself. Hidden within Paper Mario's internal test maps is an interesting little Easter egg. The words Super Mario RPG are etched directly into the floor tiles of one of the debug stages, so even if Nintendo was trying to bury the past, the ghost of The Legend of the Seven Stars still haunts this so-called reboot. But let's be honest, a name change alone doesn't explain the game's colossal development time. And here's where we arrive at a little discussed yet extremely important part of this story. The chaos that was unfolding at Intelligent Systems during this period. You see, while the press and public were busy debating whether Mario's eyes looked too small, the team developing the game was in the middle of a major crisis. A legal battle was erupting, one that involved Intelligent Systems, Nintendo, and a key former staff member, Shuzu Kaga. For those unfamiliar, Kaga wasn't just some programmer. He was the visionary behind Fire Emblem, the man often referred to as the father of the franchise. But by the late 1990s, Kaga had grown disillusioned with Nintendo's direction and, recognizing the shifting tides of the console wars, made the bold decision to jump ship to Sony's PlayStation.
After all, why not? Everyone else with a brain was jumping ship.
He founded his own studio, Tir-Nanog, and began development on a spiritual successor to Fire Emblem titled Tear Ring Saga. Unfortunately for Kaga, this wasn't just seen as healthy competition, it was perceived by Nintendo as outright intellectual theft. The similarities to Fire Emblem were impossible to ignore, and so Nintendo and Intelligent Systems launched a series of lawsuits against him, accusing Kaga of stealing proprietary game designs and developmental materials. The fallout from this kerfuffle would send shockwaves through Intelligent Systems. The studio underwent a significant internal restructuring, shifting teams around and reassigning staff, all while trying to maintain a tight development schedule on multiple projects. One of the casualties of this upheaval was Fire Emblem 64, which was quietly cancelled and later reworked into what would become Fire Emblem The Binding Blade on the Game Boy Advance. Meanwhile, the aggressive Nintendo pursued multiple lawsuits against Kaga over Tear Ring Saga, claiming the game had borrowed too heavily from the Fire Emblem blueprint. But in a twist of irony, the Japanese courts ultimately sided with Kaga, ruling that while the similarities were undeniable, the game was legally distinct enough to be released. Nintendo didn't take the loss lightly, appealing the decision several times, but all to no avail. It was a bruising bruising legal defeat that no doubt added even more tension and instability within intelligence systems during a critical development window. While no one publicly stated that Paper Mario was directly affected by this legal drama, it's not exactly a stretch to assume that the stress, resource reallocation, and team instability had knock-on effects across the entire studio.
After all, it's not easy developing a major first-party RPG when your heads of department are busy battling a lawsuit and half the staff is being shuffled around like pieces on a chessboard. In short, even before the game was moved off the doomed 64DD, even before the title was changed, Paper Mario was already caught in a perfect storm of internal chaos, external politics, and hardware obsolescence. Despite all the setbacks, delays, and internal drama, in the year 2000, Paper Mario finally received a release date. But before we got to that moment of redemption, there's one more wrinkle to revisit. The shocking early reception to the game's visuals, and let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. Let's rewind briefly back to Space World 1997, the same event where Nintendo first publicly showed off the embryonic form of Super Mario RPG 2. Among the few gameplay clips shown to the press, the most glaring takeaway for many was, well, the graphics, and not in a good way. To quote IGN's coverage of the event, they would criticise the game, stating, "Mario is a rough-looking 2D sprite at that. And he's clearly shown flipping as he runs from side to side as a weird, consciously made homage to old 2D characters, or even Sony's Parappa the Rapper." Naturally, this did not go down well in an industry that had fully embraced polygonal 3D as the new gold standard. The press was baffled, gamers were divided, and edgy teenagers who thought the future was nothing but lens flares and textured cubes turned their noses up at what looked, in their eyes, like a retro step backward. IGN even went as far as to ask, "Is Mario going retro? Is it unfinished? God help us." Looking back, the IGN quote is nothing short of hilariously misguided, a knee-jerk reaction dripping in late 90s polygonal snobbery. The sheer horror that Mario might be a gasp 2D sprite in an age obsessed with jagged polygons and muddy textures is almost comical in hindsight. Comparing him to Parappa the Rapper as if that was some kind of insult, and treating his deliberate stylistic design as a bizarre misstep rather than a creative choice, just shows how intoxicated the press had become with anything remotely resembling 3D. The line, "God help us," reads today like the overdramatic wail of someone personally offended by the absence of Z-buffering. It's a wonderful tale of a time when anything not glistening with polygons and pre-rendered CGI was treated like a developmental accident, rather than a bold, artistic statement that, as we now know, aged far better than most of its so-called cutting-edge contemporaries. As they say though, you can't spell ignorance without IGN. Bloody idiots. Of course, even back then, Nintendo had already anticipated this response. Miyamoto himself took to the stage to defend the game's visual style, stating that Super Mario RPG 2, or whatever it was destined to become, would be a game that's friendly for beginners and amateur players to start out with. He even drew comparisons to Yoshi's Story, describing the art direction as a three-dimensional picture book. This wasn't just a PR spin, it was a part of the broader creative philosophy Miyamoto had been nurturing for some time. He was increasingly interested in turning game worlds into playful storybook-inspired spaces, whimsical, textured, and approachable. That design ethos, first glimpsed in the Yoshi games, would eventually become a recurring thread in Nintendo's more stylized games such as Kirby's Epic Yarn years later. The goal wasn't just to wow with tech, it was to make the world feel tactile, artistic, and emotionally inviting. But as demonstrated by the so-called professional game critics who worked at IGN, the bold, innovative visual design that we now associate so fondly with Paper Mario was initially seen as childish, low-tech, and underwhelming compared to the polygon-heavy titles that had already completely flooded the market.
without Squaresoft's name attached. And with Nintendo pushing a kid-friendly image, many in the media began to suspect that this wasn't a worthy follow-up to Legend of the Seven Stars. Just a simplified, dumbed-down Mario game with a gimmick slapped on top, and sadly, by the time Paper Mario finally limped into stores in the mid-2000s, most of the gaming world had frankly moved on. The Sega Dreamcast had already launched and was enjoying its brief golden hour, and the PlayStation 2 was looming large on the horizon, a monolithic, DVD-powered juggernaut poised to obliterate everything in its path. In comparison, a 2D RPG on the aging Nintendo 64 seemed positively quaint, even irrelevant. The graphical style, paired with Miyamoto's own comments about the game being designed for beginners, was enough to make many hardcore players dismiss it outright. Interest in its ambitious Mario RPGs had been smothered years earlier by the fallout with Squaresoft, and to many, this belated cartridge-based title just didn't look like it could fill those shoes. Of course though, those morons would all end up being spectacularly wrong. Somehow, despite all odds, Paper Mario turned out to be a genuinely brilliant game, proving the doubters and naysayers to be a bunch of idiots. What was once dismissed as a gimmicky, kiddie-looking spin-off quickly became a critical darling and a fan favourite. Paper Mario debuted as one of the best-selling games in Japan during its release week, and would go on to become the 6th highest-scoring Nintendo 64 title on Metacritic. No small feat for a game that had spent years in development hell and arrived so late in the console's lifespan. Even IGN, once so sniffy about Mario's flipping sprite visuals, did a complete 180, ultimately calling it fantastically deep, intuitively designed and wonderfully rewarding, and declaring it the best RPG on the Nintendo 64. Next Generation magazine gave it a glowing 5 out of 5 stars, and went even further, calling it one of the best RPGs ever and a must-play, even if you've moved on to newer systems. Its quality, paired with the fact that it arrived just as the Nintendo 64 was fading into obsolescence, meant that many gamers would still initially overlook it. As a result, Paper Mario has become one of the most sought-after titles on the platform today. A decent condition PAL copy will set you back several £100s, which just goes to show how high demand remains for this once underestimated gem. In the end, Paper Mario may have looked nothing like the sequel that fans of Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars had imagined, but it forged a legacy of its own. One that combined turn-based battles with a distinctive visual flair, quirky writing, and an unforgettable personality. What began as a troubled retitled project born from a failed console add-on and a corporate breakup became one of the most beloved Nintendo RPGs of all time. Yeah, the graphics may be a bit juvenile, but honestly, when has Mario ever not looked juvenile? It's a franchise built around mushrooms, plumbers, and turtles that wear shoes. The idea that Paper Mario was somehow too childish was always a laughable criticism, and in hindsight, it's clear that the only people who got their knickers in a twist were those too daft to see past the paper-thin aesthetic and appreciate the gameplay depth underneath. Don't forget you can nab a Chrono Trigger for just $7.32, the original Final Fantasy for just $7.21, as well as up to 90% off of thousands of games, both retro and modern alike. Grab a shopping list of titles for next to nothing, and I'll see you all again soon.